There are moments in history that do not announce themselves loudly. They do not come with sirens or emergency broadcasts or breaking news banners flashing across every screen at once. They come quietly. A report filed late at night, a satellite image analyzed by someone in a basement office, a number that does not match the number it is supposed to match. And then slowly the people who understand what they are looking at begin to realize that something has changed, something important, something that cannot be easily undone. 1 minute ago, that kind of moment arrived. New information is emerging about Iran's uranium situation, and the word being used in intelligence and diplomatic circles right now is not alarming. It is not catastrophic. The word being used is something quieter and in many ways more unsettling than either of those. The word is unclear. Iran's uranium enrichment picture has become unclear. The visibility that international inspectors and monitoring agencies relied upon to track what Iran was doing with its nuclear material, that visibility has developed serious gaps. And when you lose visibility over a country's uranium program during an active military conflict, during a period when that country's government is under extreme internal pressure, during a time when the paramilitary forces within that country are operating with growing independence from the elected leadership, unclear is not a word that should comfort anyone, because unclear does not mean nothing is happening. Unclear means we do not know what is happening. And in the context of nuclear material, not knowing is its own kind of crisis. If you want to understand what is actually emerging here, not the panic, not the politics, but the real, honest picture of what unclear actually means and why it matters right now, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. This story is going to develop quickly over the coming days, and you deserve to have the full context before the headlines start arriving. To understand what is happening with Iran's uranium right now, you need to understand something that most people were never properly taught. Because the story of Iran's nuclear program is not simply a story about weapons or politics. At its foundation, it is a story about trust, and about what happens when the systems that were built to maintain that trust begin to break down. Let us go back to where this all started. For decades, the international community has relied on a single institution to monitor what countries do with their nuclear material. That institution is the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. Think of it as the world's nuclear watchdog. It employs inspectors who travel to nuclear facilities in countries around the world, verify that the uranium being used is going where it is supposed to go, seal equipment, review records, and file reports that the rest of the world uses to make decisions about whether a country's nuclear program is peaceful or something more dangerous. The system is not perfect. It has never been perfect. But for many years, it was functional enough that the major powers, the United States, Russia, China, the European nations, could make decisions based on its reports with a reasonable degree of confidence. Iran has had a complicated relationship with the IAEA for a long time. There have been periods of cooperation and periods of restriction. There have been moments when Iran allowed more access than expected, and moments when it quietly reduced that access without formal announcement. The nuclear deal negotiated in 2015, known as the JCPOA, was built almost entirely around the idea of restoring and formalizing that access. Iran agreed to limit its enrichment activities and allow more intensive monitoring. In exchange, sanctions were eased. That deal, as most people watching this will remember, did not survive intact. It was withdrawn from by the United States in 2018, survived in a damaged form for several years, and then entered a period of partial negotiation and partial collapse that left everyone's visibility into Iran's nuclear activities significantly reduced. But even through all of that, even through the years of tension and broken agreements and incomplete diplomacy, the IAEA maintained some level of monitoring, some cameras, some inspector visits, some flow of information that allowed analysts to construct a rough picture of what was happening with Iran's nuclear material. That rough picture has now become significantly rougher. Here is the central character in today's story. His name is Rafael Grossi. He is the Director General of the IAEA, the man responsible for telling the world what is actually happening inside the nuclear facilities of countries that the world is watching most closely. Grossi is not a politician. He is not a soldier. He is a diplomat and a scientist. And he has spent years carefully threading the needle between Iran's defensiveness about its sovereignty and the international community's legitimate need for verification. He has been one of the most careful, measured, precise voices on this subject throughout the entire conflict. He does not use dramatic language. He does not cry wolf, which is exactly why when Grossi begins using phrases that suggest the monitoring picture is becoming unclear, when a man known for precision starts speaking in uncertainty, the people who follow this issue most closely stop what they are doing and pay very close attention. And that is precisely what is happening right now. Before we go deeper, tell us in the comments, how closely have you been following Iran's nuclear situation? Is this something you have been tracking for years, or is today the first time you are really looking at the full picture? We rate every comment, and your perspective helps shape the conversations we bring to this channel. Now, here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, because what is emerging about Iran's uranium situation is not one problem. It is three interconnected problems happening at the same time, and each one of them makes the others significantly harder to resolve. The first problem, the monitoring gaps. In the weeks since the conflict escalated and the American blockade began, access to certain Iranian nuclear facilities has become inconsistent. Not completely cut off, that would be a clear, declarable crisis that would trigger a formal international response. What has happened is more subtle and in some ways more difficult to deal with. Inspector visits that were scheduled have been postponed. Cameras that were installed to provide continuous monitoring of enrichment activities at specific facilities have experienced what Iranian authorities describe as technical disruptions. Data transmissions from monitoring equipment that were flowing regularly to IAEA headquarters in Vienna have become intermittent. Each of these things, taken individually, could be explained innocuously. Equipment fails, schedules change during wartime. A country under active military and economic pressure has other priorities than facilitating international inspections. These explanations are not unreasonable. But taken together, the postponed visits, the camera disruptions, the interrupted data flows, they create a picture that analysts in Vienna, in Washington, in London, and in Tel Aviv are looking at very carefully right now, because the combination of these gaps means that the international community has lost reliable, continuous visibility into what is happening with Iran's enriched uranium stockpile at a moment when that stockpile has never been larger and when the internal command structure controlling it has never been more uncertain. Before the conflict began, Iran's enriched uranium stockpile was already significant. Iran had been enriching uranium to 60% purity, well above the level needed for civilian energy use, though still below the 90% threshold that defines weapons-grade material. The quantity of that stockpile had been growing steadily for several years. And now, in a period of reduced monitoring, analysts cannot say with confidence exactly where that stockpile stands, how it has moved, or whether all of it remains at the facilities where it was last verified. That uncertainty is the first problem, and it is a serious one on its own terms. The second problem, who is actually in control? But the first problem is made dramatically worse by the second problem, which is something we touched on in our previous coverage and which has become even more relevant today. The question of who actually controls Iran's nuclear program right now does not have a clean answer. On paper, Iran's nuclear activities fall under the authority of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, a civilian agency that answers to the president. Pezeshkian, the pragmatist president we discussed last time, has constitutional authority over this institution. And Pezeshkian, as we have established, wants a negotiated outcome. He wants a deal. He understands that Iran's nuclear program, whatever its stated civilian purpose, has become one of the primary obstacles to any lasting resolution of the current conflict. But the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, has its own interest in Iran's nuclear capabilities. It always has. The IRGC has historically viewed the nuclear program not just as a scientific achievement, but as a strategic asset, a form of insurance, a deterrent that keeps Iran's adversaries from pushing too hard. And in the current environment, with the IRGC operating with growing independence from the civilian government, with its commanders having successfully resisted Pezeshkian's attempts to constrain their military activities multiple times in recent weeks, a question is now emerging that would have seemed almost too alarming to ask seriously just 2 months ago. Does Pezeshkian's government have full command and control over Iran's enriched uranium stockpile right now? This is not a question that anyone in an official position is willing to answer publicly. It is too sensitive. The implications of a yes or no answer are both enormous. But it is the question that intelligence agencies in multiple countries are now actively trying to answer. And the fact that they are still trying to answer it, the fact that the answer is not obvious and confirmed, is itself a deeply concerning data point. Because here is what that uncertainty actually means in practical terms. If there is any scenario, even a low probability one, in which Iran's enriched uranium material is accessible to IRGC commanders who are not fully under the authority of the civilian government, then every diplomatic conversation about Iran's nuclear program becomes enormously more complicated. You cannot negotiate a nuclear agreement with a president who may not have full control over the material the agreement is supposed to govern. You cannot verify compliance from a government that may not be the entity making the relevant decisions. While all of this was becoming clearer to analysts over the past 72 hours, something else was happening simultaneously. The IAEA Board of Governors, the governing body of the International Nuclear Watchdog, began circulating a draft resolution expressing concern about the monitoring gaps. Not a final resolution, not a formal condemnation, a draft. a signal that the institutional patience of the international community with the situation is beginning to reach its limits. That draft resolution, which was supposed to remain internal to the board's deliberations, was leaked. By the time it appeared in the European press, Iran's government had already been informed of its contents through official channels. And Iran's response to learning that a formal international censure was being prepared was, predictably, not to increase cooperation. It was to signal that further restrictions on inspector access might be forthcoming if the international community chose to pursue a confrontational approach. That is the feedback loop. That is the trap that everyone is now inside. Iran restricts access. The international community moves toward censure. Iran responds to the threat of censure by signaling further restrictions. The censure becomes more likely. Iran restricts access further. The monitoring gaps grow wider. And while that cycle spins, nobody can say with certainty what is happening inside the facilities that matter most. The third problem, the clock and the threshold. Here is the technical reality that gives everything else in this story its urgency. And I want to explain this clearly because it is often discussed in jargon that makes it seem more complicated than it actually is. There is a difference between enriched uranium and weapons-grade uranium. The enrichment level Iran had reached before the conflict, 60%, is well above civilian energy requirements, but still below the level required to build a nuclear weapon. Getting from 60% to 90%, the weapons threshold, requires additional enrichment. That process takes time, specialized equipment, and specific facility conditions. The question that has been at the center of international nuclear diplomacy for 15 years is exactly this. How much time would Iran need if it decided to make that final step? That time estimate is called the Breakout timeline. And over the years, as Iran's stockpile has grown and its enrichment infrastructure has expanded, that timeline has shrunk. Before the current conflict began, independent analysts estimated Iran's breakout timeline at somewhere between 2 weeks and 6 weeks, depending on assumptions about how much material it would choose to dedicate to the effort and how quickly it could reconfigure its centrifuges. 2 to 6 weeks, in the middle of an active conflict, with monitoring gaps growing, with questions about who controls the material, with an IRGC leadership that has consistently demonstrated a willingness to take unilateral action regardless of what the civilian government prefers. That is not a comfortable set of facts to sit with. To be absolutely clear, there is no confirmed evidence that Iran has made a decision to pursue weapons-grade enrichment. There is no intelligence report publicly available that says Iran is building a nuclear weapon right now. What there is, and what the emerging clarity of today's reporting represents, is a situation in which the international community's ability to confidently say what Iran is or is not doing has been significantly degraded at precisely the moment when that confidence matters most. That degradation is the story. That is what unclear actually means. But here is the part of this story that deserves more attention than it is getting. Because buried inside the alarming picture of monitoring gaps and control questions and shrinking breakout timelines, there is something that the purely fear-driven coverage of this situation consistently misses. Iran does not want to build a nuclear weapon. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say in the middle of a video about Iran's uranium concerns. But it is important to say clearly and honestly because understanding why it is true is actually the key to understanding what is really happening and what a path forward might look like. Iran's nuclear program has never been primarily about building a weapon. It has always been primarily about leverage. The program exists to give Iran a credible deterrent, a capability that keeps adversaries cautious, that gives Iranian negotiators something real to trade away, that signals to the region and to the world that Iran is a serious country that cannot simply be bullied without consequence. A nuclear weapon that is actually built and tested ends that leverage permanently. It triggers a response from the United States, from Israel, from the broader international community that Iran cannot survive. Iranian leadership understands this. They have understood it for 20 years. The program has always lived in the space just short of the threshold precisely because the threshold is where the leverage is. Cross it, and the leverage disappears, and the consequences arrive. But, and this is the crucial part, that rational strategic calculation belongs to the civilian government, to Pezeshkian and the foreign ministry and the moderate clerical establishment that has consistently argued for maintaining Iran's nuclear program as a diplomatic card rather than converting it into an actual weapon. The IRGC's calculation is different. The IRGC does not think primarily in terms of diplomatic leverage. It thinks in terms of military deterrence. And there are voices within the IRGC, not dominant, not confirmed as decision makers, but present and active, who have a very different view of where the threshold should sit and whether crossing it might now be worth the cost given the scale of the pressure Iran is currently under. This is the internal battle that the world cannot see clearly right now because the monitoring gaps have reduced the visibility that would normally allow outside observers to track what is actually happening on the ground. Here is what the turnaround actually looks like in this situation. The IAEA's GROSI, cautious, precise, deeply aware of the diplomatic sensitivity of every word he chooses, made a statement last week that was widely underreported. He said that Iran's cooperation with the agency's monitoring activities had been below what the situation requires. Not an accusation, not a declaration of crisis, a carefully measured statement from a very careful man. And then separately, through a European diplomatic channel, came a signal from inside the Iranian Foreign Ministry. Not an official statement, but a signal that Iran understood the monitoring gaps were becoming a liability, even from its own negotiating perspective. That Iran's pragmatic camp recognized that a situation in which the world loses confidence in its ability to verify Iranian nuclear activities is not a situation that helps Pezeshkian's diplomatic position. It undermines it, because a world that cannot see what Iran is doing will assume the worst. And a world that assumes the worst is a world that becomes more willing to support more extreme responses. The pragmatists inside Tehran are now making the argument, internally, quietly, without public acknowledgement, that restoring some level of monitoring credibility is actually in Iran's interest. That cooperating with IAEA inspectors, even in a limited and carefully managed way, is a tool they can use to push back against the hardliners who want to treat the nuclear program as an untouchable IRGC asset. That argument is not winning yet, but it exists. And the fact that it exists, the fact that there are people inside the Iranian system who understand that nuclear opacity is a trap rather than a shield, is the thin thread of possibility in a situation that otherwise looks very dark. The turnaround, if it comes, will not be dramatic. It will be a quietly restored camera feed, a rescheduled inspector visit that actually happens, a data transmission that resumes after weeks of silence, small things that mean large things. Signs that the pragmatists found enough room inside the system to pull it back from the edge. The same question that has been at the center of every conversation about Iran for the past 6 weeks, is whether that room still exists, whether the internal balance tips back toward dialogue before the monitoring gaps harden into something permanent and the world stops having any reliable basis for knowing what is happening with Iran's uranium at all. Let us step back now. Let us look at the full picture of what today's emerging story about Iran's uranium situation actually represents. Not as a technical problem, not as a diplomatic crisis, but as a human story about what happens when the systems we build to maintain safety and trust are allowed to decay. The International Nuclear Monitoring System was not created because the world trusted everyone. It was created precisely because the world did not. It was created in the aftermath of the most destructive conflict in human history, when the nations that had survived that conflict looked at what nuclear weapons had done to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and decided collectively, imperfectly, but genuinely, that they needed to build something that would prevent that from happening again. The IAEA, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the inspection regimes and monitoring equipment and data sharing protocols that have been developed over 70 years. None of these things are perfect. None of them have succeeded in preventing every nuclear proliferation risk. But they have represented something real and important: the collective decision of the international community to maintain enough visibility, enough shared information, enough mutual accountability, that the worst outcomes could be identified early enough to be prevented. That system is under serious strain right now, and it is important to understand that the strain is not Iran's doing alone. The monitoring gaps that have emerged over the past weeks are a direct consequence of a conflict that escalated faster and further than anyone planned for, of a diplomatic breakdown that removed the mechanisms through which access could be maintained, and of a series of decisions made in Washington and in Tehran and in the space between them that prioritize short-term pressure over the long-term architecture of nuclear safety. When the JCPOA collapsed in 2018, the monitoring provisions it contained did not simply pause and wait for a better agreement to replace them. They began to decay, slowly at first, then faster. Inspector visits became less frequent. Equipment aged without agreed replacement. Data sharing arrangements that depended on diplomatic goodwill lost their foundations as the goodwill evaporated. The architecture of visibility that took years to build was dismantled in a fraction of that time. And now, in the middle of an active conflict with the most significant strain on Iranian-American relations in a generation, the world is discovering what it means to make decisions without that architecture in place. There is a lesson here that goes far beyond Iran and the United States. It is a lesson about the difference between instruments of peace and the conditions that allow those instruments to function. You can build the best nuclear monitoring system in the world. You can hire the best inspectors. You can install the most sophisticated cameras and data transmission equipment. But none of that works. None of it, if the political conditions that allow access and cooperation are not maintained. The monitoring system is not separate from the diplomacy. It is a product of it. Every inspection visit, every camera feed, every data transmission is a small act of political cooperation, a daily, ongoing, practical expression of the choice to maintain enough trust, to maintain enough visibility, to maintain enough safety. When the diplomacy collapses, the monitoring collapses with it. They cannot be separated. This is the thing that gets lost when conflicts escalate and the language becomes about maximum pressure and military options and credibility and deterrence. The slow, unglamorous, technically complex work of maintaining nuclear safety requires a kind of patient, sustained diplomatic engagement that does not produce headlines or press conference victories. It just quietly prevents the situations that end civilizations. For ordinary people watching this, and I mean ordinary people in every country, not just in Iran or the United States, the uranium situation is not an abstraction. The most dangerous potential consequence of a nuclear miscalculation is not a political problem or a diplomatic embarrassment. It is a physical event. It has physical consequences. It produces a kind of destruction that does not respect borders or alliances or the decisions of people who never had any say in what was being enriched in a facility they could not find on a map. The generation of people who are now in their 50s and 60s, the generation that grew up during the Cold War, that did duck and cover drills in school hallways, that lived for decades with the low background hum of nuclear anxiety, that generation understands in their bones what it means when nuclear visibility begins to slip. They know what unclear means when it is attached to those particular words. They remember what it felt like to live in a world where that kind of uncertainty was the daily reality rather than the emergency exception. We have spent 30 years in a world where that daily anxiety had faded, where the systems built after the Cold War had reduced the nuclear threat enough that most people could go through their daily lives without thinking about it. That reduction was not an accident. It was an achievement. A hard-won, imperfect, fragile achievement that required constant maintenance and constant attention. The question that today's emerging situation forces us to ask, honestly, without pretending the answer is obvious, is whether the current generation of decision-makers understands that they are stewards of that achievement. That the monitoring systems and diplomatic frameworks and inspection protocols they have allowed to weaken are not bureaucratic inconveniences. They are load-bearing walls. Remove them and something structural gives way. The uranium situation is unclear right now. That word, unclear, is doing enormous work. It is carrying the weight of everything that has been allowed to decay, every inspection skipped, every diplomatic channel closed, every moment when the slow and unglamorous work of maintaining nuclear safety was traded away for a short-term political advantage that has long since evaporated. The path back from unclear requires exactly the kind of patient, dignified, mutually respectful engagement that has been most absent from this crisis. It requires finding a way to restore Grossi's access, not as a concession from Iran and not as a demand from Washington, but as a shared recognition that a world that cannot see what is happening is a world where the worst outcomes become possible for everyone, including Iran. That recognition is not impossible. It has happened before in harder circumstances. The question is whether it can happen fast enough and whether the people with the power to make it happen are willing to prioritize a quiet success over a loud confrontation. History is patient. It will record what choices were made here and what consequences followed from them. The uranium situation is unclear right now. It does not have to stay that way. But clearing it up requires something that no blockade can deliver and no threat can produce. It requires the decision, made by real people on both sides, to choose the harder, wiser, quieter road. If this kind of deep, honest human analysis is what you are here for, please subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the full picture, not just the headline. The more people who see clearly what is actually at stake here, the stronger the demand becomes for the kind of leadership this moment actually requires. Stay informed, stay thoughtful, and stay with us, because this story is far from over.